All right, welcome back, guys. We are now on to, what is it, April 9th today. Well, maybe you're watching this early, but April 9th is the day that I've scheduled this for. Um, Once again, do kind of like you did last time. Obviously, you got your questions to answer for the notes, but also, once again, add to your questions something that happened on this day in history, April 9th, and a famous birthday from today in history, April 9th. Your choice, just do one of each. So we're going to continue where we left off. We talked about the British, the French, the Americans, and we talked about briefly totalitarian dictatorships. So today we're going to turn our attention to Russia, where you will have communism take over. And we'll be looking kind of for the rest of this chapter at communist country. This is a communist country and fascist countries of Italy and Germany. So a little background on Russia. I've told you throughout the semester, Russia never really had a lot of good leaders. They always had pretty terrible leaders, and Alexander III here and Nicholas II are really no exceptions. Alexander III reigned from 1881 to 1894. He attempted to suppress revolutionary ideas and activities. He ordered the state police and courts to intensify their efforts. Uh, for strict censorship of the press. I mean, if you want to know one of the things that totalitarian dictatorship type of governments do, granted, this is before the communists take over, but they definitely try to limit the press and don't like free speech or free press. He prosecuted various minority national groups, such as the Polish people and the Finnish people. He wanted them to become more Russian in language and religion and attitude. So basically, he was trying to make them more like the Russian people. He also organized something here on your screen, we are called pogroms. These were organized massacres, unfortunately, is really what it means. Government massacres of particular groups of people, and in this particular case, thousands of Jews in Russia were killed. Many of them tried to move. So many of you guys, maybe was it 2 years ago, the musical we did at the school was Fiddler on the Roof. Maybe some of you have seen the movie as well, but it's actually taking place during this time period of Alexander III and the pogroms, and that's why in that musical the Jewish people leave, because they're getting away from the violence against the Jewish people in Russia during the time period. That did spread out some Jewish people to other parts of Europe, and some of them came to America. Some of those, unfortunately, would then end up being also in the Holocaust. So obviously, there were a lot of anti-Semitic feelings during this time period of history before the Nazis even persecuted the Jewish people. After the death of Alexander III, Nicholas II, his son, took over. He rules from 1894 to 1917. In the case of Alexander III, he died. That's why Nicholas II took over. But we'll get to 1917 later, because Nicholas II doesn't die in 1917, but he ends his reign. Once again, there continued to be revolutionary activity, a lot of discontent amongst the people in Russia. They began to organize themselves into political parties, radicals, especially. And one political party that develops during this time period, and this is the Communist Party, but the original name for the Communist Party in Russia was the Social Democratic Party. So the original name of the Communist Party in Russia was the Social Democratic Party. Let's put that in perspective for a second before we mention the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Social Democratic Party. If you guys know Bernie Sanders, he says he's not a socialist, he's a democratic socialist. That's almost the exact same thing here. Social democratic, democratic socialist. Basically, it's communist. And I would go so far as to say Bernie Sanders won't admit to it. Bernie Sanders is pretty much a communist. He considers him a democratic socialist, which is pretty much the same thing, no matter how you go about it. Now, within the Social Democratic Party in Russia during this time period, there began to be two factions, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Okay, these were the two different groups within the Communist Party in Russia, the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks broke away from the larger, more moderate group known as the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks was a smaller group of people. The real big difference was the Mensheviks were pretty much communists. They were social democrats, but they wanted to take over the country in more peaceful ways, whereas the Bolsheviks believed the only way to take over the country would be through violence. So that's really what signifies the difference between these two factions within the Communist Party. And that's pretty significant. Well, we're going to cover several things here that lead to the fall of Tsarist Russia. One of the major things that happens is the Russo-Japanese War. This takes place from 1904 to 1905. Russia was expanding out east, all the way out on the coast, and they came into conflicts with Japan, who was also kind of expanding, but expanding west. This led them into conflicts, some on land, but also some pretty famous sea battles. Uh, this is a pretty embarrassing moment for Russia because Japan is able to basically win this war. They're able to win some pretty major victories against the poorly organized and pretty incompetent soldiers from Russia. There was a lot of low morale amongst the Russian soldiers as well, and the expansionist interests of the Tsar that they really had interest in. They bring in U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt to help to bring a peace agreement between Japan and Russia, and they do create a peace agreement, which is called the Treaty of Portsmouth. In this, Russia both surrendered territory and economic advantage in the Far East to Japan. For this, Roosevelt later won the Nobel Peace Prize. But really, this is an embarrassment to Russia. To think that Russia couldn't defeat a small country like Japan in war obviously led to some people being pretty angry in Russia with their own leaders. Also, just showed one, the Japanese were more powerful than people believed, and Russia was probably weaker than a lot of people had believed. Um, Also, there was a lot of popular discontent that led to workers striking and marching. On the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg was one famous event, July 22nd, 1905. A peaceful procession of 200,000 singing men, women, and children moving towards the palace in St. Petersburg. They're being very peaceful. They are wanting change, however. They want Nicholas II to improve working conditions, to convene a national assemblies, and to set up elections so that they can have a voice in government, and so that they can have a government which is more democratic in its process. Um, Hoping that this will happen is, simply that, just a hope, because what Tsar Nicholas does is he leaves the palace and instead tells his soldiers to open fire on unarmed marchers, killing 200 people and wounding over 800 more in an event that becomes known as Bloody Sunday. Obviously, a lot of Russians were already angry with the Tsar, but this turned more and more Russians against the Tsar as they begin to look elsewhere for answers to their suffering and answers to their problems. The following months, unrest and disorder increased. Peasants' uprisings came up across Russia, strikes in factories, mutinies among the armed forces. So even the soldiers in the army are kind of deserting the Tsar and Tsarist Russia. Many of the larger labor unions in cities began to organize themselves into what are called a Soviet, which simply means a council. This would be groups of workers organizing themselves. And you saw this start in St. Petersburg, but then spread to other groups of workers in cities as well. Nicholas eventually, because of all this unrest, issued the October Manifesto, promising constitutional government with free speech and a national assembly called the Duma, which would be elected by the people. Now, interestingly, Nicholas II, however, has no intentions of really promoting a very democratic form of government or enacting social reforms. He does try to do some of his own reforms. He tries to expand Russia economically. He also tries to attempt to help them modernize their industry. But Local strikes and other symptoms of unrest continued. Dissatisfaction with the Tsar's government remained strong, and there were a lot of hardships and sufferings that began. Also, you add on to that Russia gets involved in World War One, something that many Russians really didn't want to do, which leads to the people becoming more susceptible and more welcoming of radical ideas. The Russian people first seemed to support the war. Like I said, there weren't a lot, but early on, at least, the Russian people seemed to be somewhat in favor of the war. But early disastrous defeats that we talked about last chapter briefly um, led people in Russia to have serious morale problems. Poor planning created food shortages in cities, heavy casualties, among soldiers, weakened the Russians' ability to continue fighting. To try to help the military situation, Nicholas II himself personally took command of the troops and left St. Petersburg, leaving his family at home under the evil influence of the monk Rasputin. Maybe you guys have heard of him. Um, he was a Russian Orthodox monk, uh, which was part of a sect in the Russian Orthodox uh, church known as Skopsty. They taught that the only way to reach God was by sinning and then gaining forgiveness. But basically, in short, this means you must sin more to get rid of sin. Okay. Obviously, if you're listening, that is not biblical. That's a ridiculous idea. And Rasputin would live out this lifestyle 100%. I mean, the guy was incredibly sinful, uh, committed adultery with a great deal of women, was known for backstabbing, possibly even leading to murders of people. Honestly, I don't say this very often, but Rasputin may have honestly been demonically possessed. He was almost had like a hypnotic uh, ability to control certain people. One of those was the wife of Nicholas II. He was someone who apparently had healed the son of the emperor from a blood disorder. Now, we don't say that he really did. Who knows the exact situation? But that's what it seemed like. So the empress, the emperor's wife, the czar's wife, was very accepting of him, and he became an advisor to the royal family. However, he was very greedy, very corrupt, and while the czar was away, especially, he weakened the czar's government. Political situation rapidly deteriorated, with Rasputin making terrible decisions for the family and for the government. So several Russian nobles murdered Rasputin, hoping this action would restore confidence in the government, but it did not. Instead, it continued to have strikes and riots and mobs. Um, so on March 8th, 1917, the people's anger and frustration could not be contained any longer. This is when some of the larger strikes and riots happened in the capital of St. Petersburg. As chaos gripped the city, the troops began to try to get rid of the quell, and disturbances joined with the strikers. So the troops actually joined with the strikers in overthrowing the current government. So they set up a temporary government. Nicholas II is going to abdicate the throne, which means leave the throne. And the temporary government would begin under Alexander Kerensky. Um, so it's a provisional government here during this time period. There is an E in that Alexander. I don't know why it is not on here. So Alexander Kerensky does have an E in the Alexander between the D and the R. This provisional government was led by Mensheviks. So it's led by some of those communists, but the more peaceful version of communists. Now, it's not just communists in this government, but they're the ones heading up this new effort and trying to implement some of their radical social reforms. Uh, the Bolsheviks, however, do organize to try to bring problems to this provisional government, because even though Mensheviks are in control, the Bolsheviks aren't friends with them. They want a more radical version, a version where they're in control. So they allow Bolsheviks to return the Germans do into Russia, trying to create more problems. The biggest of those we've talked about, Vladimir Lenin was shipped in by the Germans in the hopes that he would take over the government there and then eventually take Germany out of the war, which we will talk about here in a moment. So, like I said, the Bolsheviks want a more radical agenda. So Vladimir Lenin was a brilliant young man who became involved in revolutionary activities when he went to the Russian university. He began to study Karl Marx there and began to believe very much in Karl Marx's ideas and became a dedicated member of the Social Democratic Party in Russia. He later assumed leadership of the Bolshevik side of the party. Um, Although he was a follower of Marx's teachings, he did differ from Marx in several different ways. The most important is that Marx thought there was a possibility of a peaceful exchange from capitalism to communism. Lenin believed the only way to get rid of capitalism and bring communism was through violent revolution. So Lenin was definitely calling for some violence to create the government that he was wanting. Marx also believed the communist revolution would occur in developed capitalist states from spontaneous uprisings from the proletariat. You guys remember that's the working class of people, spontaneous, so not really organized, and in highly developed capitalist countries. Well, first off, Russia wasn't a very highly developed capitalist country. Secondly, the proletariat is not the one to lead the way. Lenin believed the revolution would only occur if it was directed by strong, determined leadership and a group of people who were determined to make the changes necessary. Marx had advocated a dictatorship of the proletariat so that the people would lead. Um, However, Lenin said that the real power would be amongst a small, dedicated group of revolutionaries who would lead the people, and they would obtain the power supposedly for the public interest and for the people. Now, anybody who knows anything about communist countries, you can look at North Korea today, Cuba, other countries that are China that are still communist, and they allow their people very little freedom. In some cases, like North Korea, no freedom pretty much at all. China's opened up a little bit, but they're still, they deal with situations very differently in the United States. You can look at the reaction to the COVID-19 virus as an example. Communist countries don't give their people a lot of freedom or a lot of free speech or care very much about personal rights. So Lenin eventually works to try to seize control of the government. He rallies his followers in opposition to the provisional government and championed the Soviets. So he promised peace, land, and bread to the people because the people are doing terribly. Uh, as far as what Russian life would be like during this time period, I mean, I can't really explain it. It'd be worse than it ever was in American history, ever. Worse than even the Great Depression. Worse than it, we could even be maybe coming out of this COVID-19 virus thing. Maybe we're going to be in a depression. It still won't be as bad as it was in this time period for Russia. I mean, the people were just treated terribly. The people had lack of food. The people had no rights at all. And the Bolsheviks promised that to the people. Of course, are they going to give them that? I don't know. They promised them a brighter future, but it doesn't seem like that's what happens. One of the ways, for sure, was the organization of urban labor unions to produce more radical and better organized groups of people, and that proves that those groups of people are the most susceptible to Bolshevik propaganda and the ones that were able to do the most to help bring the Bolsheviks to power. So this slide's actually a little ahead of myself. On the morning of November 7th, 1917, the Bolsheviks seized control of the government in Russia. So November 7th, 1917, Lenin and his followers went to the offices in St. Petersburg and arrested many of the leaders of the provincial government. There was very little bloodshed, and the Bolsheviks came to power with Lenin as the virtual dictator. So the taking over the government goes pretty peacefully and involves very little bloodshed. Now, Lenin's successful here for several reasons. The Russian people had not wholeheartedly supported the provisional government, partly because they wanted to remain in the war against Germany. Most Russian people, including the soldiers, desired immediate end to the fighting. In 1917, more than 2 million Russian soldiers had deserted the military. So people wanted to end the war and the peasants and industrial workers also had expected the provisional government to provide needed relief to them and solutions to their problems and to the economic problems of Russia, but they had not delivered. Of course, they didn't have that long to deliver. I mean, when you only got a half a year to fix an economy that's totally tanked, it's kind of hard to do. But it wasn't fast enough for them. So the people turned to Lenin and the Bolsheviks in the hope that they will be able to fix the problems. Now, like I said, the overthrow of the government was pretty peaceful, but the following years aren't as peaceful. A civil war erupts after the Bolsheviks seize power, mostly because they choose to come in and try to take over every part of Russia from the people. Also, outside countries are not happy that this is going on. The treaty is then signed here that ends the war, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, to get out of the war with the Germans. This part I didn't mention, but to make this deal with Germany, Russia gave up Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Belarus, the Ukraine, a third of their agricultural land, and 75% of their industrial output to the Germans. Okay. You can imagine it's going to be hard to rebuild when you give up 75% of your industrial output after this war is over, after you pull out. So this civil war is being led by two different groups. You have who's known as the Red Army. This would be the communists. At first, it seemed like the communists lacked the organization, but they were able to create a strong, well-trained army under the leadership of Leon Trotsky. You also had the opposing armies, which were simply known as the Whites. Now, they weren't called the White Army or anything. They're just called the Whites, and it's nothing to do with skin color or anything like that. That was just their nickname. These groups, the Whites fighting against communism, were actually supported by allies. Troops were sent in to Russian ports. The United States actually sent aid to help fight against the communists here in Russia. They wanted to aid anti-Bolshevik groups. Although the Whites won some notable victories, they were never able to coordinate a big enough effort and didn't really send enough resources to win. So the communists eventually are able to win this civil war and retain and keep power. So Russia becomes a communist state, and it's really the first communist state in world history. In 1918, Lenin moved the Russian capital of St. Petersburg to Moscow. For safety reasons, St. Petersburg's on the coast. It'd be easier to attack. And at this point in time, Russia's pretty weak. You know, they're just pulling out of World War I. So he wants a capital that is more inland, and that would be Moscow. And that's where it continues to be to this day. After the death of Lenin in 1924, well, I guess I should say this first. At first, this new nation is called the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. That's a very long name. After Lenin dies, and we're not done with Lenin yet, but just to get the name out of the way, you get a different name, the USSR, which stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I want you to pull your attention to something there. Socialist. So once again, those people are like, socialism is not like communism. Karl Marx is the father of socialism and communism. The name of the Soviet Union here has socialism in its title. We'll get to fascists. Nazis also have socialist in their title as well. So if you think socialism is going to lead to a good government, we can look at the past to know that it has not ended up well anywhere it's been tried on a large scale. So this new country was composed of 15 republics. However, it was very much run by the central government, which controlled virtually every aspect of people's lives. People had no real voice in government. During the violent days of the Civil War, Lenin instituted a new economic system known as war communism. This was an economic, it's called war communism, and it was a war on capitalism. In Lenin's words, it was a frontal attack on the citadel of capitalism. So they basically tried to do a complete takeover of industry. So put it all under state control, no more private owned businesses. They also attempt to take any surplus crops that any farmers have, and then they take those crops and they set the prices where they want them. Forced labor and lack of incentives brought an already ailing economy to an almost collapse. For example, by 1920, the production of iron ore had dropped 98.4% from its level in 1913. So 7 years, and they had dropped 98.4% of their ability to produce iron. That means they're operating at 1.6% of what they were doing 7 years earlier. What about cotton goods? They were down 95%. Industrial production was only 13% of what it had been in 1913. So they lost 87% of all of their industrial output. Obviously, this led to deep resentment against the communist system. The government abandoned the policy of war communism in 1921 and instituted the new economic policy. Well, interestingly, the new economic policy is pretty simple. It's a retreat from communism back to some capitalism, and various aspects of capitalism, such as private trade and profit making, became once again a part of the Russian economy. It's not going to stay that way forever, but to kind of get Russia on track and get to where they want it to go, they began to once again support capitalism. So you can basically say the Russians used capitalism to rescue communism. And this whole time, they're attempting to do something called nationalize industries, nationalize agriculture. And nationalize simply means to place under state ownership. So in a true communist country, the goal is that farmers don't own their farms. The government owns the farms. Business leaders don't own the factories or own the stores. The government owns those, and people just get to work for the government. In a communist society, everybody works for the government. Like I said, towards the end here, though, interesting that in order to fix their economy, they had to go back to capitalism for a time to try to correct a lot of the bad things that were happening. So that's it as far as notes here today. I did want to add one more question to put on for your assignment to hand in today. And that question is an easy one. Another one that's not really something you have to think about, because last time I said, what's your favorite color? This time, what's your favorite movie? You have to choose one. Okay, you can't put a list of 10 movies. Choose one. Even if you got 3 favorites, choose one and just let me know what it is. All right. Hope you guys are doing well. We will get back to this next week, and stay safe.